Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. To proceed, brothers and sisters and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, today we're going to be talking about a very important topic. It's called transcending the isms, okay? Transcending all of these worldviews, these ideas that are permeating within our culture, within our society, within our community. And inshallah ta'ala, brothers and sisters, I want to go through some key isms that we can address intellectually, rationally, and using the Quran and the Sunnah of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And some of these isms include scientism, which I'm going to explain what that means, atheism, humanism, secular liberalism, and naturalism. So we're going to be dealing with 5 isms. Now we have to understand that these isms are usually in the form of intellectual attacks concerning our religion, concerning theism, the belief in God, the belief in Allah, and concerning the fact that we hold on to the Quran and the Sunnah very dearly. And these ideological attacks, they come in various forms, via the media, via the popular press, via the influential structures in our particular society. So we have to understand this very clearly and become Muslims that are thinking Muslims. So we see and we understand the implications of certain aspects of modern culture, the implications of certain aspects of what the media says and what current politicians say and what influentials in our society say. Now, by the way, it's not an us and them mentality here, because many of these isms that we're going to be dealing with are not ideas that everybody agrees with in our society. There are many people from the non-Muslim community, academics and non-academics, that agree with our view as well. So it's not an us and them view here, but rather we need to take intellectual and moral leadership on these issues, inshallah. Now before we get into these isms, I want to give you a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah, and he said that there will come a time we will have to use the rational arguments of the Quran. And Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century theologian, may Allah have mercy on him, he was an amazing thinker, an amazing theologian, because he really understood the reality of society concerning various intellectual trends and social trends. And he thought, if this continues, there will come a time where we will have to go back into the Quran and derive its rational arguments, inshallah. Hence, Sufyan al-Thawri, one of the famous scholars of Islam, may Allah have mercy on him, he said, or rather he used to recite these lines of poetry. He used to say, when a man is used to contemplation, he will learn a lesson from everything. Now what does this really mean? This means that we need to revive this neglected ibadah, this neglected worship in Islam, which is reflection, pondering and thinking. Because it is through thinking that we are able to deal with these isms. Following on from this, no matter what the challenges, brothers and sisters, we can address these issues, because all knowledge is implied in the Quran. As Al-Ghazali, the 11th century theologian and philosopher, if you like, he said that all knowledge is implied in the signs and indications of the Quran. So let's deal with these isms and schisms, if you like. The first one is going to be scientism. Now what does scientism actually mean? Scientism basically is the view that the scientific method is the only method to render truth claims about world and reality. In other words, science and its method is the only way to come to truth. It's the only way to derive truth. It's the only way to form conclusions about the world and reality, man, life and the universe. Now, this is not true. And we're going to give some reasons. But before I do that, we have to understand we're not rejecting science here. What we're doing is we're understanding science in its correct place. We're understanding what science is and what its scope is. But there are a few people, not academics by the way, because they understand that scientism is incoherent, but rather the popularizers like Richard Dawkins or Professor Lawrence Krauss, or we have other popularizers in the media, on the web, what I would like to call the neo-atheists, apologizers, if you like, yeah? they come across with this narrative, they assume this narrative that science is the only way to form conclusions about life and the universe and truth. But this is not true for the following reasons. Number one, scientism is self-defeating because it claims that the scientific method is the only method to form conclusions about truth and about life. But that statement itself cannot be proven scientifically. So it's self-defeating. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. Because the statement, science is the only way to form conclusions about reality and about truth, cannot be proven by science. It's a metaphysical claim. It's an assumption. It's a philosophical presupposition. It's a philosophical axiom, if you like, which means a self-evident truth. And it can't be justified using the scientific method. So the irony is that the thing that it's implying can't even prove its own statement. So it's saying science is the only method to form conclusions about truth. Science is the only way to truth. Okay, well, if that's the case, can science prove that statement, which says science is the only way to truth? No, it can't. So it's self-defeating. Secondly, scientism cannot prove necessary truths like mathematics and logic. In actual fact, you need mathematics and logic before you have science. So for science to say, or scientism to say, you know, science is the only way to form truth about things. Okay, well, can science prove mathematical truths? Can science prove logical truths like 1 + 1 = 2? Now you may say, well, that's directly from experience. No, it's not. Let me give you an example. What is 1 fufula plus 1 fufula? It's 2 fufulas. Now you haven't had any empirical sensory observation of a fufula. You don't even know if a fufula exists. But you know 1 of something plus 1 of something is going to be 2 of that thing. This is a logical, necessary structure in your brain. So it transcends science, and you need logic and mathematics before you have science. So we can't claim now that science is the only way to form conclusions about things, because it can't even prove the conclusions of mathematics. The third point is science cannot prove other sources of knowledge that are really necessary. Now, in epistemology, which basically means the study of knowledge, the study of belief, there are some sources of knowledge, and one key source of knowledge is called testimony, which is basically relying on the say-so of others. Interestingly, the scientific method requires testimony. If you study the scientific method, if you go to the Berkeley website and you look at the scientific method, you could Google this yourself. The consensus of scientists or the results coming from other papers from other scientists are necessary for you to form conclusions about your own experimental data, okay? And that is testimony. You have to rely on the say-so of others. Now, they may have claimed they've done the testing, they may have claimed they've done all the results and they've done the experiments themselves, but you haven't seen it. You have to require their testimony. So interestingly, a lot of our beliefs is based on testimony too. For example, the majority of us, we believe that the world is round. Prove it. Many of us can't actually prove it. We haven't gone to the highest point on Earth to see the curvature of the Earth. We haven't flown from England all the way around back to England. So you know if you fly in a straight line, you're going to end up back into England, for example. So that means the world is round. Many of us have never done that. We've just seen pictures, photographs, and we learned it at school. All of these are testimonials. We have to believe someone is saying that this is an image or a map of the world. We have to just believe that based on the say-so of others. Now you may think, but everyone believes it. That's true, but that's still testimony. And interestingly, the thing that science requires, which is also testimony, can't be proven by science itself. It's another source of knowledge. So it shows that science is not the only way to form conclusions about things. We need this shared information via different sources of knowledge. To highlight this, interestingly, I had a debate with Professor Lawrence Krauss, and he was like, evolution is true. And I said to him, okay, fair enough. Prove it. And actually I asked him, have you done all the experiments yourself? Because he said, everything must be proven by experiments. And I said, this is very interesting because do you believe in evolution? He said, yes, of course. I said, have you done all the experiments yourself? He said, no, I haven't. There you go. You have to believe the testimony of other scientists or other conclusions or other philosophies. So testimony is a valid source of knowledge. And therefore, it shows that science is not the only way to form conclusions about things. You need other sources of knowledge too. So scientism is incoherent. It's wrong. Now, we have to understand, brothers and sisters, this doesn't mean Islam is against science. Of course it's not. Because even Allah says in the Quran, in chapter 41, verse 53, we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth. So from this perspective, Allah is saying, look into the empirical world. Look into the interconnecting principles of nature. There's going to be some truth there for you. In this light, Professor of Philosophy Shabir Akhdar, in his book The Quran and the Secular Mind, a philosophy of Islam, he basically talks about the objectives, if you like, of the Quranic ayat concerning the rububiyyah of Allah, the lordship of Allah, the oneness of Allah, the fact that Allah created everything and He sustains and maintains everything. And he mentions it in a very nice way. He says, nature's flawless harmonies and the delights and liabilities of our human environment with its diverse and delicate relationships are invested with religious significance. Created nature is the cryptogram of a reality which transcends it, and nature is a text to be deciphered. Evidences accumulating in the material and social worlds and in the horizons jointly point to a hidden immaterial order. In a nutshell, these ayat are referring to there's a hidden wisdom behind the design in the universe. If there's a design in the universe, there's a designer. Look at the empirical nature of ourselves, of reality, and you'll come to the conclusion that there must be some kind of purpose and wisdom behind this creation. So Allah is telling us to look into scientific knowledge from this perspective. And we know that Islam has had an unprecedented brothers and sisters, unprecedented kind of influence on the West concerning science. Look at Islamic Spain when we had the convivencia, which means coexistence. Because of the justice principles and the tolerance principles from the Quran and Sunnah, we were able to create a society that Muslims and non-Muslims looked into the interconnecting principles of nature. So they could actually understand what is reality. And from this perspective, even thinkers and historians and Arabists like Professor Thomas Arnold in his book, The Preaching of Islam, very famous book that's used in academia, he concludes that if it wasn't for Muslim Spain, we wouldn't have the Renaissance in essence. And he says, Muslim Spain had written one of the brightest pages in the history of medieval Europe. And then he continues, and it was from her, Muslim Spain, that Christian scholars received what of Greek philosophy and science they had to stimulate their mental activity up to the time of the Renaissance. So, just to conclude this point, scientism is incoherent because it says that science is the only method to use to find truth. This is not true. As we discussed, there are other sources of knowledge like testimony, which science can't prove, mathematics and logic, it's self-defeating, and everything else we just mentioned. So let's go to the second ism, atheism, which basically says there is no evidence for the existence of God, or the evidence available is insufficient, or the rejection of a divine, the rejection of a designer, a cosmic designer, the rejection of God. Now, interestingly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't really focus in general on atheism, because atheism from this perspective is what we would call an emotional aberration. It's a psychological state. I don't think it's an intellectual state. Because brothers and sisters, what you realize is that atheism itself is unnatural, because we believe in the fitrah, coming from the root which shares words such as fatrun and fatarahu. What does that mean? It means as if something Allah created within us to acknowledge Him and to worship Him. And we see that there are various accounts in the psychology of religion and in anthropology and sociology that indicate we do have an innate nature that Allah created within us, a fitrah, which means innate nature, to acknowledge Allah and to worship Him. For example, Olivera Petrovich, she did a study and she concludes that our innate natural psychology is to believe in a transcendent God, in a God that is unlike human creation. Also from the perspective of sociology, you had the likes of Professor Justin Bartlett. He basically did a study on that children naturally, even if they come from atheist backgrounds, are naturally kind of structured to believe in supernatural agency. So this is very important for us to understand, but also we have to also understand the Quran does indicate a kind of challenge to atheism, but in only one verse, I believe. Two verses actually. In chapter 52, verse 35 to 36, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, or were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? Or did they create the heavens and the earth, the cosmos, the universe? Bel la yuqinun. Indeed, they have no true faith or belief. Now, interestingly, we know these verses refer to the human creation, but many of the ulama, the mufassirun, those who explain the Quran for us, they discussed and said this actually means anything that was created, because Allah used the word khuliqu, khuliqu. Now, khuliqu from a classical Arabic perspective means something that emerged, something that wasn't always there, something that came into being, something that was started. And that's why Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century theologian, he said, so whatever is besides Allah, it is all makhluq, created, originated, muhdath, coming to be after not existing, preceding by its own existence, by its own non-existence. So basically Ibn Taymiyyah is saying everything apart from Allah had a beginning, it wasn't always there. So if we apply these verses properly and we understand them, we will understand or come to the conclusion Allah is giving us four logical possibilities. Four logical possibilities on how anything came into existence, which includes the whole universe. And these are the four logical possibilities. Number one, it was created from nothing. Number two, it created itself. Number three, it was created by something else that was created. Or number four, it was created by something uncreated. Now, could the universe be created from nothing? Well, what do we mean by nothing here? What we mean, brothers and sisters, is the absence of something or the absence of that thing. So the universe wasn't there. So could it come into existence just via or from nothing? Of course not, because we could even establish this mathematically. 0 plus 0 plus 0 is equal to 0. Exactly. So when you have nothing plus nothing plus nothing, you're always going to have nothing. And that's why P.J. Zwart, in his publication About Time, he says, if there is anything we can find inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. Now you may have some atheists who say, popularizers, not academics, they'll say, what about the quantum vacuum? Things pop into existence by nothing. Now, brothers and sisters, the quantum vacuum is basically, just imagine I had a big hoover, like a cosmic hoover, and I sucked away all particles in the universe and all radiation. What you'd have left is the quantum vacuum. And they say that's nothing, but you have particles emerging from this nothing. That's not true, because the quantum vacuum is still something. It's something physical. It's a sea of fluctuating energy. Go to any thinker, any cosmologist, any physicist, they will never claim that the quantum vacuum is the absence of something. It's still something. So that contention is not very valid. So we know the universe couldn't come from nothing. What's the next one? Could the universe create itself? Well, this doesn't make sense either, because that means that the universe was in existence and not in existence at the same time. Because for the universe to create itself, it means it once wasn't there and then became there, because it means it was created. But to create itself would require us to believe that it was there before it was there for it to be there. Confused? Exactly. Let me make it easier for you. Could your mother give birth to herself? Exactly, your mother couldn't give birth to herself. It's just an impossibility. So the universe couldn't create itself at all. Now the next option is, could the universe be created by something else created? People may agree, because even in our tradition in Islam, we believe there was something before the universe for the universe to be created. As Allah and the prophetic traditions, the ahadith, they mentioned smoke. There was this type of smoke, and then the whole cosmos was created. So someone may argue, well, maybe the universe was created by something else created. Maybe. But is that an ultimate explanation? Of course not. Let me explain why. Because if ultimately the universe was created by something else that was created, maybe smoke or whatever you want to call it, then what created that? And if you argue, well, something else created, then what created that? Then you may argue, well, something else that was also created. Well, then what created that? If that goes on forever, you would never have the universe in the first place. Let me give you another example. Say this universe that we live in today, this cosmos, this universe is called Universe 1. And Universe 1 was as a result of Universe 2. And Universe 2 was as a result of Universe 3. And Universe 3 was as a result of Universe 4. And Universe 4 was as a result of Universe 5. And that goes on forever. Would we ever have Universe 1? No. Let me give you another example. Say I'm a sniper and I want to shoot something. I want to shoot the wall. And before I could shoot the wall, I have to ask permission from the sniper behind me. But if that sniper also has to ask permission, and that permission goes on forever, am I ever going to shoot? Of course not. So the point here, brothers and sisters, is that we couldn't say that the universe ultimately was created by something else that was created. Because if that goes on forever, then we wouldn't have the universe in the first place. Because I like to make a joke out of it sometimes and say, well, if this universe was ultimately created by something else that was created, then what created the created thing that created the universe? And what created the created thing that created the created thing that created the created thing that created the universe? Hold on a second, and what created the created thing that created the 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 universe? And if that goes on forever, you'll never have a universe in the first place. That's why the Islamic thinker and philosopher, if you like, Dr. Jafar Idris, he summarizes this point and he says, there will be no series of actual causes, but only a series of non-existence. The fact, however, is that existence are around us. Therefore, the ultimate cause must be something other than temporal causes. Meaning, if the universe was created, which we know it came into existence, it was created. Therefore, it couldn't have been created by something else created, because we know it's absurd. We will never have the universe in the first place. Therefore, there must be something uncreated. And this leads us to the final logical possibility. There must be something uncreated. And that's why Allah says in the Quran, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Allah is uniquely one. Allahu Samad. Lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Say, Allah is uniquely one. He is self-subsisting, eternal. He begets not, nor was he begotten. There is nothing like unto him. Interestingly, on this point, brothers and sisters, we have the philosopher Abraham Varghese in the book There Is a God, written by Antony Flew. He says something very interesting. He says, now clearly, theists and atheists can agree on one thing. So people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God do agree on one thing. If anything at all exists, there must be something preceding it that always existed. How did this eternally existing reality come to be? The answer, it never came to be. It was always there. It always existed. Take your pick, God or the universe. But since the universe was created, we know it began, therefore it must be God. Now some people may argue, well, this all assumes that the universe began. Well, yeah, of course it assumes the universe began, because it's well known now. We don't live in the 1940s anymore. We don't believe in the steady state theory that the universe had no beginning, no end. Time is equal to 0. The universe emerged. Many people call this the Big Bang. But whatever you call it, the point is there is a mathematical, philosophical and scientific consensus that the universe wasn't always here. So therefore, we can still apply these 4 logical principles. Let me summarize them for you. Since the universe began, we can explain it in the following way. It came from nothing. It created itself. It was created by something else created, or it was created by something uncreated. We know it couldn't come from nothing, as we discussed. We know it couldn't be created by itself, as we discussed. We know it couldn't be created by something else that was created. Therefore, it was created by something uncreated. And this makes sense of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because this uncreated creator, brothers and sisters, he must be eternal, because he's uncreated. If he's uncreated, he's always there, eternal. He must be transcendent. What does that mean? Basically, we're saying لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, as the Quran says. There is nothing like unto him. Transcendent means, as Ibn Taymiyyah explained, that creation must be distinct and disjoined from the creator. For example, if I were to make my laptop, do I become the laptop? If I were to make this wall, do I become the wall? Of course not. I am distinct and disjoined from the wall. Similarly, Allah created the universe. He's not in the universe. He is distinct and disjoined from the universe. Also, Allah must be powerful. There are, I believe, 10 to the power 40 or 10 to the power 80, which is 10 with 80 zeros, atoms in this universe. That's a lot of atoms. If we just take one atom and we split it, there could be a whole nuclear explosion, for example, a release of an immense amount of energy. So the one who created that one atom plus all these billions of atoms is also going to be very powerful. Also, we know that this creator must be knowing or intelligent. Because if I were to, for example, take my watch off, let me just take my watch off, and I were to drop it, why does it fall? Because of the law of gravity. So someone who creates a law implies a lawgiver, and a lawgiver implies knowledge or intelligence. So when we keep on thinking about these things, we understand that, you know what? Not only is there an uncreated creator, but this uncreated creator must be God, must be Allah. Because of what we're just discussing. He is powerful, he is transcendent, he is knowing, and we're forming the conclusion of our understanding of who God is, namely who Allah is. So from this perspective, brothers and sisters, atheism is false because we have a very powerful argument against atheism. The next ism is humanism, which basically says you can be good without God. That's true. But I want you to understand is that when humanists say you can be good without God, they're assuming that good is objective. So we do agree, and even the Quran agrees, and the Prophet ﷺ in various hadith, when he praised non-believers because of their justice or because of the compassion or because of the charity, these things were objective, and we knew not only were they objective good, but we could understand and appreciate that non-Muslims can have good behavior. We really appreciate this. We don't have a monopoly on good behavior. But humanists say you don't need God to be good, which is true in a sense of, do you need God to tell you what good is? Some good. No, because some of them are based on our nature, which the Quran and the Sunnah agree with. But they're assuming that good is objective. For example, killing a 5-year-old, an innocent 5-year-old, is objectively morally wrong. They would agree that. They're not saying it's subject to their own opinions, to their own minds, or to their own feelings. They would even say, even if the whole world were to come together and say it's okay to kill a 5-year-old, they would still say no, it's still objectively wrong. That position, brothers and sisters, requires God's existence. So humanism fails because they want to deny God and say you can live a good life without God, which may be true. But if you believe and you have that conviction, that sense of ought, that we know something ought to be, that itself requires God. So it's a self-defeating worldview. You can be good without God. Well, maybe, but you can't have good without God. And that's the point. And that's why Professor of Theology and Ethics Ian Markham, he writes, embedded in the word ought, like something ought to be, a moral sense, is the sense of a moral fact transcending our life and world. The underlying character of moral language implies something universal and external. So what we're trying to say here is, brothers and sisters, that you can only have objective good if God exists. So you may be good without believing in God, like you may have some good behavior, and you may, for example, find what good is without God, but you can never have good without God. You can never have good in an objective sense. And the humanist and humanism assumes that good is objective. If it's objective, then it means God must exist. Now why? Because God is the only idea, the only concept that transcends our subjectivity. Because we all differ. Because we all have our own sense of personal kind of opinions, whether it's based on feeling or based on our own subjective internal brain experience. And this is why Professor Ian Markham, he says, God explains the mysterious ought pressing down our lives. And God explains the universal nature of the moral claim as God is outside of the world. And God the Creator can both be external and make universal commands. So in a way, God is the only kind of objective reference point. He transcends human ikhtilaf, human differences. So from this perspective, brothers and sisters, God is the only basis, the only foundation to ensure that morals are objective. And if you don't have God, what's left? Well, some people claim you have biology and you have social consensus or social pressure. And they say, therefore, you can have objective morals. No, you can't. Because let's take biology first as an example. Look what Charles Darwin said in the 19th century. He gave a very interesting example. And he said, if men, human beings, were reared under precisely the same conditions as the hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. That's if we were reared just like the hive bees. Now you could even think, well, if we were reared according to the same biological conditions as the nurse shark, well, therefore we would think it's okay to rape women, because the nurse shark wrestles and basically shoves its mate, which is tantamount to rape. It is no wonder Bentham, he basically said that human rights from a Darwinian perspective is nonsense on stilts. It's just elevated nonsense. Because it's true. Because biology renders morals meaningless. It's just a reaction. It's just a response to certain conditions. And they don't have any ultimate objective meaning. Like morals have evolved like our unwanted hair, nose hair, or our teeth. And that's why philosopher of science Michael Rules, he explains this well. And he says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands, feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics or morals is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Now, some people claim, what about natural selection? Natural selection formulates the basis for objective morals. No, it doesn't. All natural selection does, as the moral philosopher Philip Kitcher says, is that it allows you the capacity to formulate ethical rules. It doesn't give you a foundation for objective ethical rules. So we know biology can't be a basis for objective morals. What about human consensus? That we come together as human beings and we agree on something that makes it objective. No, that's not true. Because human society is based on what? One subjective individual plus another subjective individual plus another subjective individual plus another subjective individual. So you have all of these subjective individuals. So subjective individuals plus more subjective individuals, you're going to have just more subjective individuals. It cannot form an objective basis. So social pressure or people coming together to form conclusions about things, especially moral things or moral realities, can never be objective because it's based on human subjectivity. And if we were even to claim that society can provide a foundation for objective morals, then there'll be some problems, because we will have to say that what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1940s was a good thing, because they came together as a German society to say it's morally okay to kill 6 million Jews. But we know that's wrong. But to claim that your source and foundation for objective morals is society would mean you can't disagree with what happened in Nazi Germany. So from this perspective, brothers and sisters, we see that God is the only foundation for objective morals. As He created the whole universe, He knows us better than we know ourselves. His commands come from His good nature. And therefore what He commands is good because He is good, and He defines what good is. Because that's His nature by definition, as Allah is Al-Qudus, the holy, the perfect. The second, not the second, I think it's the third or fourth now, I think. ism is called secular liberalism, brothers and sisters. Now, secular liberalism is basically the separation of culture and politics from religion, with the emphasis on individual rights. Now, this doesn't mean we don't believe in individual rights. Of course we do. But let me just discuss this for you. We have to understand that Islamic tradition balances individual rights with social rights, because we believe society also affects individuals and individuals affect society. And we also believe that you can't divorce politics away from Allah, because Allah knows us better than we know ourselves. So this, in a summary, is secular liberalism, the divorcing of God from politics and emphasizing just on individual rights, not social rights as well. And we have to understand that this whole secular liberalism philosophy, brothers and sisters, actually came from a particular problem in Europe. It never came from a problem around the world. It was just specific to Europe. Because what happened was, you had the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. They used to use the forceful arm of the state to prevent any thinking that was against its own doctrine. So it basically oppressed people. And that created or facilitated the likes of Martin Luther, who was the reformist, the Protestant reformist if you like. He wrote a thesis attacking the Catholic tradition, and he pegged it on a church door in Wittenberg, attacking the Catholic Church, the Catholic tradition. And that facilitated a huge kind of emotional, intellectual environment, coupled with trade laws and all these funny things that are happening in Europe. That you had the 80-year wars, the religious wars, the 30-year wars, the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day. I mean, Europe suffered a lot because of religion. And therefore, they had to emerge with this doctrine, which was liberalism or liberal secularism. Because they said, fine, God is not making sense. He can't deal with our society because we're killing each other. So everything has to be very personal and very individual. So let's focus on individual rights outside of religion. So this whole secular liberalism came from a particular product, which was the European history. Now, what some secular liberals do, they say everyone must share this worldview and political framework. No. Why? Because you're just assuming that everyone has the same shared European experience. But when we look at the Islamic history, there was an amazing harmony, generally speaking, by the way. Not that our history is perfect, but generally speaking, there was an amazing harmony between the people in power and the scientists and the thinkers. And there was this amazing harmony. So we didn't have the same problems that Europe faced. So we have to understand it from that perspective. Now, the Quran obviously deals with this in a very firm way. In chapter 5, verse 50, Allah says in the Quran, "Then is it the judgment of the time of Jahiliyyah, ignorance, they desire? But who is better than Allah in judgment for people who are certain in faith?" Meaning, Allah must be involved in your life, in your social, political life. And also, when we read the Quran and Sunnah, we understand that there is a balance between individual rights and social rights. It's not just based on the individual. So, how do we deal with this ism, secular liberalism? Well, we've understood the context, which was based upon the oppression of the Catholic Church. And then the thinkers like Hugo Grotius, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke and Samuel Pufendorf, they had to create a doctrine, a philosophical doctrine, which was therefore to emerge as secular liberalism, which was to say God therefore is away, we must divorce him away from society, it's just about an individual thing, not about politics. And that we just have to focus on the individual rights. As Professor Jean Charvet, in his book Human Rights and Liberal Project, he basically says that they had to form an individualistic doctrine of what the human being is. That we see the human just as an individual, not really connected to society. And that's quite flawed, because we know the individual in reality is affected by society, and society affects the individual as well. So from the onset, although they thought they had to produce this doctrine to prevent bloodshed, they didn't think about it very carefully. And this is why Professor Ian Hunter from the University of Queensland, he actually discusses this about liberal government, that it's tied to a political, historical narrative, which is quite shallow. He says, liberal government, together with the associated phenomena of political secularism, so secular liberalism, arose in response to particular historical circumstances which remains tied. And he continues, the philosophical shallowness of liberal orders is a direct outcome of the historical emergence. So in essence, they're saying this whole secular liberal paradigm came from a certain historical context that only belongs to Europe. Not everyone shared the same historical experience. So why are you assuming that everybody has to share now your new political world order? No, it's not the case. Maybe there are other worldviews that were able to balance between individual and social rights, and were able to balance between religion and society. Not everyone suffered the same way as Europe has suffered, and that's why Professor Ian Hunter is saying this is one of the failures of secular liberalism, because it's based on a particular historical context that not everyone shares. Also, we have to understand, brothers and sisters, that secular liberalism really focuses just on individual rights. Don't get me wrong, we believe in individual rights, but we believe in the balance between individual rights and social rights together. So liberalism itself comes from a doctrine called individualism, the individual rights. And that's why political philosopher Marilyn Friedman, and she's a feminist by the way, she said individualism underlines some important versions of liberal political theory. Now individualism, or what is also called atomism in political language, so individualism and atomism is the same thing. Individualism is actually quite shallow. If we could show that individualism is wrong, therefore liberalism is not a correct philosophy for politics or life, because it doesn't view the human being in the correct way. Now you may ask, well, what is individualism? Well, in the words of Professor Marilyn Friedman, she says individualism is viewing the human being, you, me, the self, as an individual divorced away from social attachments and obligations. And you see his identity or her identity as away from society. It's not formed via social pressure or social norms or social kind of learning, if you like. And this is why philosopher Charles Taylor, he's a political philosopher, he questions why we started with individualism in the first place. He said, the very idea of an argument whose foundations was the rights of the individual would have been strange and puzzling. Why do we begin to find it reasonable to start a political theory with an assertion of individual rights and to give these primacy, which means to give them importance? Because surely there's a relationship between the individual and society and the individual. So in order for us to show the shallowness of liberalism, we just have to show that individualism, which is its basis, is actually wrong. And here's why. Number one, when you look at social psychology, brothers and sisters, you see that our development of individuality or of ourselves is not just based on what they used to call the independent constructor. If you study developmental psychology, you see that it's not just based upon just the way, just me. I learn by myself as an individual constructor, an independent constructor. But rather, they've moved away now to understand that a lot of our learning, according to cognitive developmental research, is not so abstract and individualistic. It's based upon social attachments and socially prescribed tasks and routines. So we become ourselves, not as a result of just on our own, but via social communal attachments, routines and tasks. So therefore, our very development of who we are is not based on individualism, it's based on a social phenomenon. Number two, now we have to consider aims and values when we determine the individual, because our identity is based on aims and values. Now interestingly, aims and values can only be understood within a social context, not an individualistic context. As the political philosophers Shlomo Avneri and Avner de Shalit, they argue, we cannot analyze their behavior as if they were abstract entities, as if their values existed somewhere in the distance outside, so to speak. This is the critique of the image of the person put forward by the individualists, who tend to distinguish between the one who is and the values one has. So values and aims that make who we are is only understood in a social context, not an individualistic context. Also, brothers and sisters, we have to understand that there are dynamic links between me, you, and the rest of society. And we affect each other. Society affects us and we affect society. That's why in academia this is well established in social psychology. Take for instance the social psychologist Vivian Burr. She said in her book, which is called Social Constructionism, for example, in a capitalist society, competition is fundamental. Society is structured around individuals and organizations that compete with each other for jobs, markets, etc. So that where competition is a fundamental feature of socio-economic life, what you get is competitive people. So if you have a society like capitalism that basically focuses on competition, you're more likely to get people who are competitive in society. And that's so true. When you generally analyze capitalist and non-capitalist nations, you see capitalist human beings within a capitalist society, they're far more competitive. So society does affect us, and we affect society as well. So from this perspective, brothers and sisters, we see that secular liberalism, the way to deal with this ism is in two ways. Number one, we understand that secular liberalism came from a specific European historical context, and that makes it shallow because not everyone shares that context, and it assumes that the only way to have peace is to basically move God away from the picture for politics and just to focus on the individual. And this is not true, because if you look at Islam, it never had that historical problem. Also, the way to deal with liberalism, the liberal aspect of secular liberalism, we understand that liberalism is based on a philosophy called individualism or atomism. And individualism is the view of the self being divorced away from social obligations and attachments, as per the words of Professor Marilyn Friedman. And we know this basis, individualism, the basis for liberalism, is wrong because of aims and values that make up who we are actually understood in a social context, not an individual one. The way we develop cognitively, our brains are developed by social attachments and routines and tasks, not the independent constructor, the individualistic constructor, as the past developmental psychologists talked about. And also that we understand that there are links between society and individual and society. So this means the basis for liberalism, which is just to focus on the individual, is false. So therefore secular liberalism is false from this perspective. Finally, brothers and sisters, let's deal with the last one, which is called naturalism. And this is very important because it deals with atheism and it deals with so many different things. What is naturalism? Naturalism is the worldview, brothers and sisters, that this universe is a closed box, okay? There's nothing outside of this universe, and if there is, it doesn't affect the universe. And everything inside this box, everything inside this closed universe, can be only understood by physical phenomena and physical processes. So supernatural doesn't exist. Zero. Well, you know what? This is the philosophy of many scientists, unfortunately, and it's the philosophy of many atheists, because no matter what evidence you give right into their face, they'll reject it, even if it supports the supernatural, because they have this presupposition. These are the lenses in which they view the world. So that means they never allow to entertain any evidence that would indicate the supernatural, because they have these lenses. It's time we took them off, because it's an assumption. It's like faith. That's why even the atheist, Professor Michael Rules, he said, let me make a concession to you. Naturalism is based on faith because they presume that there's no supernatural. And therefore, everything they see, they'll always ignore the supernatural because they presume it doesn't exist in the first place. So how can we show that naturalism, which is the worldview that there is no supernatural, which is the worldview that everything can be explained via physical processes, how can we, brothers and sisters, show that this is wrong? Easy. Just talk about yourself. Now, what do I mean by this? Talk about the fact that you have a consciousness. Consciousness is not only about thoughts, thinking, taste and pain, but it's about the subjective inner experience. Like, I can have a strawberry, but the way the strawberry tastes and feels for me is unique to my subjective experience. For example, I have intentions, or what's called intentionality. I can intend to do something in the future. For instance, I intend to become a doctor, for example. Also, pain, the level and appreciation of pain may be different from me, even though I may have the same injury as somebody else. So we have subjective experiences, which is what it is to be like Hamza. What it is to be like Hamza eating a chocolate or eating a strawberry. It's personal to me. Now, in neuroscience and in the philosophy of the mind, yes, we know consciousness is correlated, is somehow linked to the brain. But it is not the brain, and the brain is not consciousness. Because you could never find out via physical processes that subjective experience. Let me explain this a bit better. Say I have a chocolate in my hand, okay? This is a chocolate in my hand, and I'm eating it. Now, the neuroscientists, they could find out that I'm eating something. They could even find out, brothers and sisters, that I'm eating chocolate. But they could never find out, ever, even if science advances a million years, they could never find out what it is like for me to eat a chocolate. Because this, even the language, what it is like subjectively for me, is a non-scientific language. It's a non-scientific phenomena. It's immaterial. It's mental, not brain. It's mental. It's my own personal experience. They will never be able to find out just by looking at electrochemical firings in my brain. This is what you would call the hard problem of consciousness. And this is something that Professor David Chalmers, he discussed in his book, The Character of Consciousness. And it's called the hard problem, which is that materialism, naturalism, physicalism, anything physical in terms of a process or function can never explain or tell us what it is like for Hamza to eat a chocolate. So from this perspective, we could see consciousness in the brain as different, but also in the following analogy. Take, for instance, a car and the driver. The car is the brain, the driver is the consciousness. If the car doesn't work, no matter what consciousness does, nothing's going to work. But also, if the driver is not working, then the brain's not working either. So we know they're both correlated, they're both linked, the driver and the car, but they need each other, for instance. Okay, there is this link. But we have to understand that they are not the same thing. And a key way of understanding this is by talking about the hard problem of consciousness, which is, yes, Mr. Atheist or Mr. Scientist, you may be able to tell that I'm eating a strawberry by looking at chemicals in my brain, but you would never, electrochemicals in my brain, but you would never ever be able to find out what it is like for me subjectively to eat a strawberry. And that itself is a fact of consciousness, and that cannot be explained, brothers and sisters, by scientific or natural processes. And that's why in the book, The Character of Consciousness, Professor Chalmers, he discusses certain attempts by scientists and materialists and naturalists to explain this phenomena, and they've all failed. And he mentions certain strategies they use, which are failed strategies. The first strategy, he says, is they simply explain something else. The naturalistic researchers, the materialistic researchers, they basically say the hard problem of consciousness, which is what it is to be like, cannot be explained scientifically, so we just ignore it or we deny it. For example, Professor Dan Dennett, he actually wrote the book, The Consciousness Explained. And Consciousness Explained in his book is very funny because he says he ignores the hard problem. He actually says it doesn't exist. Meaning that he's saying that we don't have subjective experiences, which is obviously false because we know we do have subjective experiences. So it's no wonder that many philosophers called his book, not that it should be called Consciousness Explained, but it should be called Consciousness Explained Away. The other strategy, brothers and sisters, is to claim that subjective experience is explained by understanding the physical processes in our brain. But this is not true, because how can any electrochemical activity, how can that tell us what it is like for me to eat a strawberry? This is impossible. Also, they won't be able to answer the following question, which is, how do these processes bring about subjective experience? How can just pieces of matter put together produce a subjective conscious experience? The other strategy, brothers and sisters, is that they try and explain the structure of experience. But this doesn't tell us anything, because it doesn't tell us why they should be experienced in the first place and how subjective experiences emerged, and how can we assess what these subjective experiences are in the first place. So from this perspective, science and materialism and naturalism can never ever tell us or give us the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Yes, it can tell us that we're having thoughts, that we may be having pain, that we may be dreaming, but it could never tell us what it is like for me to dream, and it could never tell us what it is like for me to eat a chocolate, or what my level of pain actually is for me subjectively. Science and physical constructs can never tell us these things. what it is like to be me, what it is like for me to eat a chocolate, what it is like for me to tolerate pain, what it is like for me to dream. This likeness, what it is to be about, can never be explained physically, as we discussed. And that's why even materialist, naturalist, neuroscientists like Christoph Koch, he says the following. Well, let's first forget about the real difficult aspects like subjective feelings, because they may not have a scientific solution. Also, neurophysiologist John C. Eccles, he said, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, meaning everything could be reduced to physical process. And that's true, because to claim that everything can be reduced to physical parts and processes means that you're going to deny your own subjective experiences, which you can't because they're a fact. So just to end this point, we see that naturalism fails as a worldview because it says everything can be explained via physical processes. But we know this is not true because of consciousness, because the hard problem of consciousness, which is what it is to be like Hamza, what it is to be like Hamza eating a chocolate. What is it like for Hamza to eat a chocolate? What is it like for Hamza to dream? What is it like for Hamza to tolerate pain? This subjective experience can never be explained by physical processes, as we just discussed. Therefore, naturalism fails, because naturalism is the worldview that everything can be explained by physical processes, but it can't even explain the hard problem of consciousness, as we discussed. It is no wonder that analytical philosopher J.P. Moreland, in his essay, The Argument from Consciousness, he expresses similar views. He said, the truth is that naturalism has no plausible way to explain the appearance of emergent mental properties in the cosmos, meaning how consciousness arose, how the subjective experience can be explained. And he quotes Ned Block, and he basically says that Ned Block confesses that we have no idea how consciousness could have emerged from non-conscious matter. And Ned Block says, we have nothing, zilch, worthy of being called a research program. Researchers are stumped. So let's just summarize, brothers and sisters. What we discussed today is a very lengthy lecture, but inshallah you should get a personal recording of this so you can study this further for yourself, because these are the challenges that we face as Muslim youth and as Muslims who want to become thinkers in this Western society, to essentially want peace and justice and harmony for the whole world. This is what we want: peace, justice and compassion for everybody. So we discussed scientism, atheism, humanism, secular liberalism and naturalism. Scientism was wrong because scientism says that science is the only way to form conclusions about truth and things. That's not true, because you have logic, mathematics, testimony, the say-so of others, which are all essential for our learning. Atheism is wrong because the universe began, it couldn't come from nothing, couldn't create itself, couldn't be created by something else created, must have been created by something uncreated. Humanism is wrong because it does claim that you can be good without God, which may be true, but they assume that good is objective, and if good is objective, then it requires God's existence, because God is the only basis for objective morals. Secular liberalism claims that you can't have God in politics, and that the individual is based on, rather, society, and the way we see the human being must be based on individualism, seeing the individual self as divorced away from social obligations and attachments. Again, that's wrong. Secularism came from a specific historical product in European history where religion, the Catholic Church, was oppressing the masses. That never happened in Islam. And also liberalism, which is based on individualism, sees the self as just an individual away from social attachments and obligations. We know that's not true because individualism is wrong, because of the mere fact that when you look at developmental psychology, you see that we have cognitive development based on social obligations and social tasks and social routines. We see that in social psychology there is a link between society and the individual, and individual and society. We have to understand that aims and values who make up who we are cannot be understood just in an individualistic context. Aims and values must be understood in a social context. Also, brothers and sisters, we see naturalism is wrong because that's the worldview that there is no supernatural, that the universe is a closed box, nothing interferes with it. Everything in that box, everything in the universe can only be explained by physical processes. And as Professor Michael Rules, who's a naturalist, or who is a atheist, he said, as a concession, it's faith, because it's just a presupposition. It's the glasses in which they put on to view the world. And the way we take these glasses off is by showing to them, actually, there are many things that could never be explained just by physical processes, and that includes consciousness. And we don't mean the type of consciousness that, yes, I'm thinking, and they could find some neurochemical flashing, therefore they know I'm thinking. No. But rather, it is the hard problem of consciousness, which is what it is to be like. So scientists can tell that I may be eating a strawberry, but they could never say, ever, what it is like for me to eat a strawberry. That subjective conscious experience can never be understood in a physical perspective, in a naturalistic perspective. Therefore, naturalism fails, because it's claiming that everything can be explained by physical processes, but it can't even explain the hard problem of consciousness. So we dealt with all the isms, brothers and sisters. May Allah bless you with Jannatul Firdaus. Keep strong, keep learning, and really be beacons of light for the wider society, because we want peace, justice, harmony, compassion for everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.